In this Shadows over Innistrad Remastered Draft Guide, I'll be providing all the information you need to find success in the format. I will be discussing the set mechanics, the top commons, archetype overviews, the combat tricks you need to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Starting things off with the set mechanics, the most complicated ones are Delirium, Madness, Investigate, Emerge, and the bonus sheet. Starting things off with Delirium, it cares about having 4 or more different card types in your graveyard. The card types being creature, land, instant, sorcery, enchantment, artifact, and planeswalker if you're lucky enough to get one of those. It is a mechanic that is either on or off. So if you have the 4 types, you have Delirium, and if you don't have the 4 types, you do not have Delirium. So it's one of those mechanics that really rewards you when you reach that threshold. Madness is a way to cast your cards when you discard them. So Fiery Temper can be cast for 1 red from your hand, but if you discard it to some other effect, you can simply pay its Madness cost of a single red mana. Next is Investigate, which is a fancy way of saying make a clue token, which is an artifact that lets you pay 2 mana to sacrifice it and draw a card. So it's a nice card advantage mechanic. Next is Emerge, which is a way to cast your creatures for a bit cheaper if you're willing to sacrifice creatures and able to do so. The way it works is you can either pay the casting cost in the upper right, so for Wretched Gryff, 7 mana, or you can pay its Emerge cost, which is 5 and a blue, which is then discounted by the converted mana cost or mana value of whatever card you sacrifice to it. So if you play a 3-drop on turn 3, on turn 4 you could sacrifice it in order to Emerge Wretched Gryff for 3 mana, which is the 6 mana Emerge cost minus the 3 mana value from the creature you sacrificed to it. It ends up playing out pretty smoothly once you get the hang of it. The final mechanic that I'm going to discuss is the bonus sheet, which is a rotating batch of cards from the history of Innistrad. There will be 1 card from the bonus sheet in every single pack. They come at a variety of rarities, and they are often quite powerful for limited, so keep your eye out for them. Moving on to the top commons, in white at number 1 is Bound by Moonsilver. It's a removal spell that is very flexible because if you cast it early and your opponent then plays a more problematic card, you can simply move Bound by Moonsilver to it by sacrificing a permanent. It's also nice that it lets you sacrifice your lands, so in the late game it makes it easier to turn on Delirium. At number 2 is Sigardian Priest, a cheap creature that lets you tap things, which is always a potent effect. And then at number 3 is Thraben Inspector, a cheap card that replaces itself thanks to the clue token it generates. Moving on to blue, at number 1 is Drag Under, a card that gets you a nice tempo advantage while replacing itself. At number 2 is Ingenious Scab, a card that looks mediocre, but because of prowess and the ability to pump its power, it can hit your opponent for a lot of damage out of nowhere, and is also really hard to deal with during combat because they never know how big it's going to be. At number 3 is Jace's Scrutiny, a card that helps you stall the game, trigger your instants and sorceries cards, and also help you dig through your deck thanks to Investigate. In black, at number 1 is Dead Weight, a removal spell that can kill a small creature and contribute an enchantment to your Delirium count. At number 2 is Olivia's Dragoon, a nice 2-drop that sets you up to enable your Madness cards for the rest of the game. And at number 3 is Gissa's Bidding, a card that generates a couple of creatures and can even be cast for cheap if you're able to enable the Madness. Moving on to red, at number 1 is Incendiary Flow. 2 mana, deal 3 damage to any target, and it even exiles, which is especially important in this set because there are graveyard synergies. At number 2 is Galvanic Bombardment, a nice way to kill small creatures, and it can even kill bigger creatures if you're able to assemble a few of them in your deck. And then at number 3 is Deranged Whelp, because a 2 mana 2/1 with Menace is just a really nice creature to play early in the game, as it pushes through a lot of damage. Moving on to green, at number 1 is Rabid Bite. It's a great removal spell for green because you tend to have big creatures, and it's not even a fight spell, so you're just able to take something out without having to worry about it dealing damage back. At number 2 is Ulvenwald Captive, a great 2-drop to play that ramps you into your mid-game, and then in the late game can transform into a problematic creature. So really just a nice card to have in any green deck. And then at number 3 is Gnarlwood Dryad, a 1/1 death touch that grows into a 3/3 over the course of the game, which means it can start attacking very well and blocking even better. Moving on to the color rankings, they are all pretty close, and this is more of a tiebreaker than anything, but at number 1 is red, number 2 is green, number 3 is white, number 4 is black, and then blue is coming in at number 5. Looking at the archetypes, starting off with red-white, which is just a straightforward aggressive deck. It gains access to Ride Down as a great removal spell that helps push damage, Uncaged Fury as a combat trick that can end the game out of nowhere, and Subjugator Angel as a top-end card that removes all of your opponent's blockers. Next is blue-black Zombie Control. Drenau Corpse Trawler is a great card for this deck because it can give all of your zombies Death Touch if it needs to, which lets them trade in combat. Compelling Deterrence is a nice bounce spell that can snipe a card from your opponent's hand because you'll almost always have a zombie, and Haunted Dead is a great way to enable madness and also just give you a recursive threat in the late game by pitching your extra lands. Next is green-white, which is a humans aggro deck. Veteran Cathar is really nice as a 2-drop that can give your other humans and even itself double strike. Hamlet Captain buffs all of your humans when it attacks or blocks, and Courageous Outrider is a way to find the other key humans within your deck. The blue-red archetype cares about casting instants and sorceries. Mercurial Geists can get really big in a hurry if you're able to chain some of those spells together, and if you can land a Thermo Alchemist early in the game, it can ping your opponent for plenty of damage while helping block on the ground. Rise from the Tides is the ultimate finisher in this format, and in this deck it can make something like 5 or 6 zombies, which is just going to end the game. Moving on to green-black, it is an archetype that cares about enabling Delirium. Mournwillow is a nice aggressive threat that can make it harder for your opponents to block if you can enable Delirium. Vessel of Nascency is the perfect card for this sort of archetype because it fills your graveyard, puts an enchantment in the graveyard, and also gives you a little bit of card selection. And then finally, Kindly Stranger is a nice little payoff if you're able to get Delirium because it turns a 3-mana 2/3 into a card that actually kills one of your opponent's creatures, and it's the sort of thing that if you can enable it is really quite powerful. Next up is white-blue, which is a deck that cares about spirits and flyers, so it's a pretty classic archetype. You can use a card like Spectral Shepherd to chip through in the air and protect your other spirits from removal. You can use a card like Nebelgast Herald to keep your opponent off guard and tap down their creatures. And you can also use Topplegeist if you are able to enable Delirium to keep your opponents off balance and tap down their biggest threat. Moving on to red-green, it is an archetype that cares about wolves and werewolves. Ulrich's Kindred can really make your wolves problematic by giving them indestructible if you're able to attack. Gaia Reach Bandit can really reward you by turning into a potent werewolf that lets you transform your wolves at will. And then you can also gain access to Howlpack Resurgence, which buffs all of your wolves and werewolves. Moving on to white-black, this is a value mid-range deck that can use Delirium relatively effectively, as well as just quality cards up and down the curve. Anguished Unmaking is a great removal spell. Reaper of Flight Moonsilver is a nice 5-drop that can enable some sacrifice synergies and also just hit for tons of damage in the air if you are able to enable Delirium. And then Accursed Witch is just a great mid-range threat that when it dies, turns into a card that slowly drains your opponents out of the game. So just a nice card to have in this mid-rangey deck. Moving on to green-blue, this is a deck that cares about clues and investigating. Ongoing Investigation is an absolutely fantastic uncommon that even though it looks like it might have a low impact on the game, is just a stellar card overall and just takes over the game, so definitely a card to prioritize. Graph Mole gives you time to sacrifice all of your clues and really get that card advantage by gaining you life whenever you sacrifice a clue. And a card like Erdwall Illuminator is a great card to deploy early in the game because it's a cheap blocker that also gets you card advantage every time you investigate. Black-red is a vampire aggro deck that cares about enabling madness and getting a bunch of vampires into play. Olivia's Bloodsworn is a great card for this deck because it's very aggressive as a flyer and can give your vampires haste. Call the Bloodline is a great way to enable madness while building up your vampire army, and Fury Blade Vampire hits really hard if you have cards that you're willing to discard to it. Next up is the combat tricks. These are all of the combat tricks available at common, so you'll want to know them so you don't get blown out. White has Strength of Arms and Borrowed Grace. Blue has Spontaneous Mutation and Jace's Scrutiny. Black has Borrowed Malevolence and Grotesque Mutation. Red has Rush of Adrenaline and Borrowed Hostility. And green has Confront the Unknown and Aim High. Because these are commons, you'll see them frequently in combat, and you just definitely don't want to get wrecked by them. Moving on to some trap cards to avoid. First up is Brain in a Jar. This is a card that looks like it could be powerful, but by the time you get it to a high enough amount of counters to start casting reasonable spells, you'll generally just have that amount of mana anyway, and you've just put yourself down a card and invested a bunch of mana for nothing. Next is Hope Against Hope, which is generally just not powerful enough as an aura to be worth investing as a card, because there are plenty of bounce spells to punish this and also just straight up removal spells to punish this. And then finally is Lupine Prototype, which looks really cute as a 2-mana 5/5 if you end up getting rid of all the cards in your hand, but it really struggles against bounce spells and the frequent removal found in this set. Next up is the combos section. First up is the combo between Graph Rats and Midnight Scavengers, because they are a meld combo that you can assemble with commons and uncommons, and if your Graph Rats dies, you can even return it to your hand using the Midnight Scavengers. If you get them both into play, you can meld them into the Chittering Host, which is a really cool thing to pull off. Next up is the combo between Lone Rider and Apothecary Geist. Lone Rider can flip into the very powerful It That Rides as 1 if you're able to gain 3 life in a turn. While you'll often try to do that by hitting them and maybe using a combat trick to use the Lone Rider's lifelink, Apothecary Geist gains you the 3 life you need to transform the Lone Rider without even needing combat. The final combo is a 3-card combo between Crawling Sensation, Groundskeeper, and a discard outlet. The way Crawling Sensation works is it says whenever 1 or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, the first time each turn, create a 1/1 green insect creature token, which means that you can discard those lands directly from your hand to the graveyard and still get that 1/1. Groundskeeper lets you return lands from your graveyard to your hand, so if you pair them with a discard outlet, you can be doing this on every single turn. So you get a 1/1 on your opponent's turn, a 1/1 on your turn, and overall it's just a great way to start building up an army of tokens. Looking at the mana fixing in this set, at uncommon, there's a cycle of 5 lands that just come into play tapped, and a cycle of 5 lands that can come into play untapped if you have a basic land of their 2 colors in your hand to reveal when you play them. There's also Weirding Wood in green, which can fix your mana. In the colorless mana fixing, there is Terrarion, which is also nice because it'll put an artifact into your graveyard to help enable Delirium. Wild-Field Scarecrow is in a similar spot because if you sacrifice it, you'll get an artifact and a creature into your graveyard for Delirium, while also getting some lands for your trouble. And then finally, Cryptolith Fragment is a way to generate mana of any color, but if players' life totals get too low, it will transform into Aurora of Emrakul, which doesn't help you fix your mana. Though it is a pretty solid creature, so you end up winning either way. But Cryptolith Fragment is a way to fix your mana if you need that as an option. Moving on to some final tips. The first one is that Madness cards can be cast at instant speed, so be ready for unexpected spells. A card like Weirded Vampire is the sort of thing that you would generally expect to be cast during your opponent's main phase, but if they're able to discard it, they can cast it for its Madness cost immediately, which means they can cast it on your turn, or during combat, or things like that. So expect to see some creatures coming in at unexpected times, or some buff spells, or some removal spells that maybe you don't expect, because Madness lets them be cast as soon as they are discarded, which can mess with the typical rules of timing. The final tip I have for you is that it can be worth playing weaker cards if they help you enable Delirium. Explosive Apparatus is a great example of this because it's a relatively weak artifact that can send itself to your graveyard as part of using it, which means it can help you enable Delirium by putting an artifact into your graveyard, and since artifacts are less common than things like creatures or instants or sorceries, then it can be really useful for getting that 4th type for Delirium. So including a couple cards like that can really power up your deck, because the difference between having Delirium enabled versus not can be really huge for the power level of your other cards. So keep that in mind when building your decks. That is going to do it for this draft guide. Thank you so much for watching, and if you did enjoy it, remember to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way till the end of this video, leave hashtag ShadowDrafter in the comment section down below. Good luck in your drafts, and I'll talk to you next time.